firstly, that the arc of history, it moves in the direction of the oppressed, and ultimately we are winning. A war is not merely won by obliterating a population and killing the weakest in that population, namely children, which Israel excels at. A war is won in your ideas being convincing to the widest amount of people. And so Israel then, using that metric, has absolutely lost the war. There are more enemies of Israel than ever before. There are more people who view Zionism as an anti-human ideology than ever before. There are more people that see Israel as practicing cruelty on an industrial scale than ever before.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Kalik, and this is Dispatches. Since October 7th, the West's mask is fully off. The naked brutality of the collective narcissism that defines the US-led imperialist order is on full display, and so is the gaslighting. Western leaders decry the civilian toll in Gaza while continuing to arm Israel with zero conditions. We're told Israel is doing what it can to protect civilians while fighting a war against evil terrorists, even as our phone screens show image after image after image of bloodied and mutilated babies, interspersed with Israeli officials and soldiers celebrating the killing of more than 12,000 Palestinian children and calling for more of it. We're told at least Israel warns them to evacuate, even as the Israelis intentionally bomb the evacuation zones. We're told that those who speak out against this genocide are actually motivated by anti-Semitism, rather than a desire for never again, no matter who. And in the ultimate gaslight, we're told it's all the fault of the victims, that they're being slaughtered en masse because Palestinians brought it on themselves by using their families as human shields. Because of Gaza, many are waking up to this horrific abuse, learning about the true nature of imperialism and the fact that even in their global north countries, in the so-called garden, they're not actually so free. Gaza has shown our rotten, parasitic system for exactly what it is. But there are some who knew this all along. One of them is Loki, rapper, activist, and host of the Watchdog podcast on Minpress News. And he joins me today. But before we jump into it, this is just the first half of this episode. The second half is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Loki, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here today.
Well, it's so wonderful to have you on. Thank you for making the time. And let's just jump right into it. We're entering the fifth month, or we've already entered the fifth month of this horrific Israeli genocide in Gaza that is fully backed by the West. And what we're seeing happen right now as we're recording this is there's something like 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering, or more accurately, they've been forcibly corralled into Rafah in southern Gaza near the border with Egypt. That's where they were told to go from the rest of Gaza for safety, as Israel carpet bombed and destroyed everything it possibly could from the north on down. Yet here we are with Israel essentially trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza. That was their intention from the beginning, trying to push people into Egypt, and talking about and having started an actual military campaign, essentially targeting people in these so-called evacuation zones in Rafah. And you and I both know this was the plan all along. You've talked about that. Before we go on to some other related topics around this, I'm just curious, as we witness this horror show continue in the South, what are your thoughts?
Well, essentially, early on, the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence had documents from it leaked, which stated clearly that the most appropriate series of events would include Palestinian population being quote unquote evacuated out through Egypt. We've seen Danny Danon, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, going out of his way to really proselytize for this idea of other countries in the world accepting the Palestinians. We've heard that Israeli diplomats have attempted in meetings with African and Latin American leaders to offer some type of incentive for accepting large numbers of Palestinians. And it's also been reported that the Egyptian government have been offered debt relief to receive, I mean, it could be over 1 million Palestinians into Egypt and absorb them. So what Israel really is attempting to do is an extension of Plan Dalit, which was revealed as existing during the Nakba period. But what you have now is the technological advancements afforded to Israel by the last 70 years have led to a hyper Nakba, which is high tech, but also is being live streamed around the world while it's happening. So, as I say, it's an extension of Plan Dalit, which is the displacement of Palestinians, even more so than they already are. You've got the main settler groups that exist in occupied Palestine, some of whom actually have existing trade relations with institutions of US government. So technically, they are funded by the US government, some of these settler organizations which have united together to push for settling Gaza. It has to be remembered that there was never more than 8,000 Israeli settlers in Gaza at any time. So what's happening now is a real apocalyptic shift, which is about driving out 2 million Palestinians and replacing them with God knows how many Israeli settlers. And unfortunately, our political leaders have largely been salesmen for this entire project. They've wrapped it up in acceptable language to try and reconfigure people's perception that this is about a particular political group or is about the October the 7th, when in actuality it's about the extension and the continuation of Zionism in a more aggressive form.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the backing of the West there, because, you know, the U.S., I'm sure you know, the U.S. Senate just voted 66-33 to push forward this ban on funding for UNRWA, the refugee UN agency that basically continues to give humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees. And cutting this funding off right now is so extreme considering Palestinians in Gaza. You mentioned, I think, the term apocalyptic. I mean, that's essentially what's been created in Gaza, an apocalypse. People are every day getting up if they're lucky enough to still be alive, or in some cases, you know, I don't know, for some people, maybe at this point, what the situation in Gaza that's been created is hell. You know, I've heard people say death is better. I mean, just imagine how horrific a situation has to be for somebody to say that. But people are getting up every day and, you know, they begin their search for survival, for their search for food and water. They're starving to death in Gaza and dying of thirst or dying of cold if they're not dying by Israeli bombs. And so to cut off humanitarian funding in this moment is especially cruel and vicious. So you have 66-33. That's the vote in the U.S. Senate to continue to make sure that that funding stream continues to remain cut, as well as to make it easier for Biden to send more weapons to Israel, to not even have to go through Congress. I mean, it's just completely insane and backwards. And I do want to play this clip of Joe Biden. I think it was a Freudian slip. It was making the rounds. And he was speaking essentially about the military operation in Gaza. So here is what Biden had to say about that.
King and I also discussed the situation in Rafah. As I said yesterday, our military operation in Rafah, the major military operation in Rafah, should not proceed without a credible plan for ensuring the safety and support of more than 1 million people sheltering there.
So there you have Joe Biden saying our military operation in Rafah. I mean, and then, of course, he goes on to do the typical gaslighting of American officials, which is to say we want to, you know, ensure that civilians are protected, even as there's no evidence that civilians are being protected in any way. So I'm curious your thoughts on that slip of his.
Well, I think the phrase you used, Freudian slip, is certainly more accurate than what some may describe it as, which would be the ramblings of a senile caretaker of the decline of the US empire. It's more a Freudian slip, and I'll explain how. Early on in Israel's campaign in Gaza, Biden uploaded, or obviously somebody employed by the US government uploaded mistakenly a picture of Joe Biden greeting individuals from the US Delta Force and praising them for their work in hostage rescue in Gaza. Now, the importance of the US Delta Force can really not be underestimated. They were the essential operators in the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. You saw sniper teams from the US Delta Force surrounding the airport in Baghdad, and you had snipers positioned around the airport disguised as maintenance workers. And a camera was attached to the weapon of one of them, giving a live stream back to the US Embassy in Baghdad, where the Delta Force ground commander was looking on. Now, the US has this pride of place, really, for this particular aspect of the US military, and in its ability to neutralize quote unquote terrorists. So it's my belief that Israel would be very unlikely to attempt to kill Yahya Sinwar or other key leaders of Kata'ib al-Qassam without at least an advisory role from the US Delta Force, if not direct activity on the ground. What we also know is there is a US mercenary group called Forward Observations Group that is active in Gaza with the Israeli military, led by somebody who had just finished fighting in Ukraine, where he got involved through the Nazi Azov battalion. Also, it was revealed by The Intercept that the Biden administration had deployed a team from the US Air Force to assist Israel with targeting. And during this period of war, the US has delivered over 25,000 tons of weapons to Israel through 40 ships and 280 aircraft landings since October. As Benjamin Netanyahu said at the very beginning of this genocidal campaign, we need three things from the United States, and that is munitions, munitions, and munitions. And that was exactly what was provided by the US administration. So when you look at the cutting of funding to UNRWA, this has been a long time aim, of course, of the Israelis and the Trump administration at one point. So it's not necessarily a new tactic, but it's particularly sharp and particularly spiteful to take place when you have the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza not having enough to eat. As you've said, people are reported to be dying from dehydration and all manner of other diseases which spread in such conditions. And it's interesting that the King of Jordan was standing next to Joe Biden at that time as somebody who is a key salesman of US policies in the region. We cannot forget the services that Jordan has provided to Israel and the United States in this war against the region. And really, Jordan is one part of what I like to call the axis of assistance. Jordan has been exporting to Israel in direct opposition to what its population wants. And you saw Jordanians go to the Alembi Bridge to try and block these exports, and they themselves were blocked by the Jordanian police. We also know of reports that the Jordanians shot down and intercepted rockets shot from Iraq towards Israel early on in the campaign. And of course, Jordan has been a key part of the land bridge that has been established by the UAE and Saudi Arabia to get around the Yemeni blockade of the Israeli port of Eilat. You also have, unfortunately, Egyptian ships leaving Port Said to deliver food supplies to the Israelis. Also, really the level of regional complicity in this war is never ending. Of course, you have the example in the UAE of an arms company by the name of Edge Group, which is a state-owned Emirati arms company, which has investments of around $15 million in an Israeli drone company called Highlander Aviation. Now, that drone company manages Israeli airspace. In addition to that, the UAE has founded within its borders a UAE subsidiary of Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest arms company, which provides over 85% of all Israel's drones, which built the wall in the apartheid wall in the West Bank, which provides bullets to the Israeli occupation, and really works hand in glove with the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So the UAE founded a subsidiary of Elbit Systems by the name of Elbit Emirates. What you also have is the UAE, over the last few years, has a deal with Celebrite, an Israeli intelligence firm, which was founded by alumni of Israeli Unit 8200, the military intelligence surveillance unit. This company, Celebrite, hacks phones for the UAE government of its own citizens. And that deal was actually brokered by the former head of Israel's external intelligence agency, Mossad. And interestingly, Saudi Arabia has also used Celebrite in the past decade. It's also used the NSO group, famously responsible for the Pegasus spyware. Now, in the case of the NSO group and Celebrite, there is evidence in both of those examples that the companies themselves have remote access to the information that is being gathered through their software and devices. So essentially what you're talking about is actors within the region outsourcing the functions of their internal and external intelligence agencies to outgrowths of Israeli intelligence agencies. And so what that means is that this axis of assistance has been steadily integrated in Israel's operations. And certainly with the case of Yemen, we are seeing ways in which those regional actors are having to be quite low profile about their involvement. But for instance, Bahrain are part of the US and UK-led coalition against Yemen. But also you've even seen the Saudis carry out bombings in Yemen during the same time as the US and UK campaign against it. So what you have is essentially an axis of assistance and an axis of resistance in the region, and they have diametrically opposed positions on Gaza. They just speak in interesting terms. You know, essentially, when you have Joe Biden appearing there with King Abdullah, what he's trying to do is trying to beautify the image of this horrific genocidal war. And of course, Abdullah would do well to remember the person he was named after, which is his grandfather. King Abdullah in 1948 was charged, rightly so, by many with collaborating with the British in his and also the Zionists in terms of land, which the Jordanian army and the Arab forces, which were led by Faris, by Glub Pasha, was the British officer that led the Jordanian forces and thus led the Arab forces. King Abdullah was blamed for the loss of Palestine. And what happened to King Abdullah after the Nakba? He was assassinated in Al-Aqsa because of this treachery. So King Abdullah of Jordan would do well to remember the example of his grandfather and step off this moving train.
Yeah, that's a really good way to describe it, the axis of assistance. And I do want to get a bit more into the idea of the axis of resistance. But first, before we move into more of regional, like specifically regional issues, I just wanted to raise the fact that, you know, we know that the Western governments, particularly the U.S., I mean, the U.S. could tomorrow make this war stop. We know that they're capable of doing that because this could not happen, like you said, without munitions from the U.S., all the green lights. And it's like this massive campaign of gaslighting that everybody sees through. Maybe at some point, people were a little bit more of like in a confused fog about the role of the U.S. Like, yeah, they make mistakes in Iraq and like, Libya and all these places that they end up messing up, but they have good intentions. It's like the civilized garden, just trying to civilize the brutes in the global south. But I think Gaza is like a really mask off moment for all of these imperial powers who are kind of pretending, but not really. And it just at some point starts to get embarrassing. And what I'm alluding to here is somebody like Matt Miller, the State Department spokesperson, who seems to want to go viral every day he has to speak. And here's just another example. And this is an exchange he had with Matt Lee of the AP about the idea of leverage. Because on the one hand, we have these people in the US government telling us that they want Israel to protect civilians. They don't want Israel to attack Rafah, where there's 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering, but they're willing to use no leverage. And then this is just interesting what he said here. I'm going to play it for you.
What levers have you used?
So we have used diplomatic levers. The secretary
That
has.
means that means the secretary and the president and you and Kirby and whoever else standing up and saying, wagging your finger and saying that that's not really leverage.
We have engaged with them on at a multitude of levels at this administration, and as you look at the list that we just went through with Humera, we have seen them take steps at our urging that have had real tangible impact, but they have not been enough.
But what levers have you actually used?
I think that when the United States of America stands up and says something publicly, it matters.
But you haven't.
That's a lever,
but you haven't said
but
that
to
there
my
be
point,
any consequences
to my point, we
in
have
terms
seen
of money or military assistance, right?
But we have seen, because of the policies we have pursued, we have seen improvements along these specific areas. We have seen tangible improvements. Again,
okay, but
not
I'm
the
just
level
asking you what leverage have
but
you
also,
used? What leverage have you brought to bear?
I just went through it.
What have you gone?
I think the words of the President of the United States, the words of the Secretary of State matter, and we have seen. Hold on, we have
over
seen,
the top,
and we have seen
leverage,
and we have seen the government of Israel respond to it. Not always in the way that we want, not always to the degree that we want, or to the level that we want, but our interventions, we believe, have had an impact, and we will continue to pursue them because we believe they do.
Okay, so Loki, what are your thoughts when you see that sort of argument take place? Because none of that's true. Like, I don't know what else to say beyond that. But how do you perceive those sorts of back and forths between these spokespeople, propagandists, and journalists willing to ask them hard questions?
I think ultimately, internally, there are degrees of disagreement between the US and between Israel. And often people try to posit Israel as a US bulwark in the Middle East. But I think this situation is revealing very much the tail wagging the dog. You know, in normal circumstances, and this is before October 7th, Israel would be receiving $10.4 million a day, $430,000 an hour, $7,229 a minute, and $120 a second from the United States government in military aid. There is no equivalent to that in the world. The closest is Egypt, and a lot of the military aid to Egypt is wrapped up in supporting Israel. And so there is this way in which the United States is subjugated to the Israelis. But there's also an aspect of this which I don't think is focused on enough. And that is that Israel is considered by US intelligence officials to be one of the most aggressive states in launching surveillance operations on US soil. And in many cases, targeting the very corridors of power. If you look at the case of Jonathan Pollard, the US naval intelligence analyst, he was believed to have begun spying for Israel in 1984, and he handed over the 10-volume manual of the US National Security Agency, which laid out how the United States obtains its signals intelligence. He also revealed to Israeli intelligence the names of thousands of US informants. And he even propositioned the technical director of the US Navy Ocean Surveillance Information Center, Richard Haver, about giving a back channel to the apartheid regime in South Africa. And ultimately, his work helped Israel obtain nuclear weapons. Now, eventually, he was caught by the US government and sentenced to life imprisonment for spying for Israel. Now, it was then claimed that Netanyahu himself attempted to use tapes of former US President Bill Clinton's conversations with Monica Lewinsky to leverage the release of Jonathan Pollard.
Really?
And
I didn't know that.
And actually, it was in 2000, an article was published by Insight magazine, which claimed that Israel was able to penetrate 4 White House telephone lines and relay real-time conversations on those lines from a remote site outside the White House directly to Israel for listening and recording. Now, it's also believed that the argument that the Israelis made to Clinton about the Lewinsky tapes, and this is before the affair became public knowledge, he was said to be, quote unquote, newly impressed by the argument to free Pollard, and went on to approach the CIA director George Tenet with the issue. However, Tenet, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld all stood firmly against the idea of releasing Jonathan Pollard, with even Tenet threatening to resign. So often we look at a situation where the United States and Israel certainly act as one hand vis-a-vis the Middle East, but there is a dynamic which has some level of antagonism within it. I mean, even in 2019, when you had Trump in power, figures within the U.S. intelligence services accused Israel of planting cell phone surveillance devices around the White House known as stingrays, and they are believed to look very similar to cell towers and are able to trick cell phones into interacting with them and passing vital information. And even in 2021, the AP reported that at least 11 US State Department officials had iPhones that had been hacked by the Pegasus spyware. This would, of course, have given the NSO group, which was set up by alumni of Unit 8200, wide access to US government secrets. So essentially, the United States is a key target for Israeli surveillance operations. And none of that is accounting for the potential role that Jeffrey Epstein may have had in subjugating somebody like Bill Clinton. So while the United States is certainly a force that acts with Israel in heart, mind, and soul when it comes to this regional war, it is also, without a doubt, a key target for Israeli espionage.
I mean, we also can't forget the fact that obviously there is daylight sometimes between the sitting U.S. administration and the Israelis, particularly when you have a Democratic president, because, in many ways, the Likud party is an extension of the Republican Party. But, we should also remember that during the Obama administration, you had Netanyahu actively, and openly, publicly lobbying against the sitting president's policy on Iran. He even came and gave a speech to the U.S. Congress advocating against the sitting U.S. president's attempt to do a nuclear deal with Iran. It was a pretty insane moment, and it was more open and blatant for everyone to see. But of course, what you're describing is something far more behind the scenes and insidious, for sure. Though, it's a bit, all we can really do is speculate when it comes to the Biden administration. But, Biden has told us repeatedly that he is an ardent Zionist, and he strongly and ideologically believes in this cause. It's still somewhat stunning to see this not even just inability, but refusal to step in and put any red lines on anything. And moreover, just to see an almost kind of like bloodlust from this administration. And, you're in the UK, so you do pay attention to UK politics. I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the British involvement in this war. Is the British government, intelligence agencies, military as complicit as the U.S. has been? Are there fractures internally inside the UK ruling apparatus on how to deal with Gaza? What's going on there?
So Britain has a secret military agreement with Israel, which was signed in 2020. It has certain implications for when either of those parties enter war, but our information about it, of course, is limited. An interesting aspect, though, of all of this is that the defense minister at the time, Ben Wallace, has now gone on record effectively accusing Israel of war crimes in Gaza. So there seems to be trouble in paradise. However, since the beginning of this genocidal campaign, Britain has launched 65 spy missions over the top of Gaza. The Shadow R1 spy plane has flown over Gaza and certainly shared that information with the Israelis. The British RAF has sent 48 military flights to Tel Aviv in planes that certainly could be carrying weapons. We also know that 9 Israeli military jets have landed in this country. And during this period, an existing agreement between Britain and Israel has Britain training Israeli military officers. We look at the bases that Britain has in Cyprus, which the NSA has full access to and shares information with Israeli intelligence directly. We've also seen US flights delivering weapons to Israel throughout this period leave from the British base in Cyprus. Britain, of course, sent 500 extra soldiers to that base, no doubt to assist Israel in the event of a further escalation with South Lebanon and Hezbollah. You also have the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, going on record as claiming that the British are intercepting the communications of the Palestinian resistance factions through their bases in Cyprus and sharing them with the Israelis. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the British story with this genocidal campaign is that early on, the British government issued a D-notice to journalists. Now, a D-notice is when the British government writes to you as a journalist and says, we'd prefer you do not publish information about this particular topic because it would harm national security. And that particular D-notice directly referenced SAS, which is the British Special Forces operations in Gaza. So if there were no SAS operations in Gaza, why would the British government need to tell journalists not to publish anything about it? That is the key question here. And I believe that later on down the line, more information will come out about SAS operations when it comes to Gaza. But when you look at, for instance, the horrific footage today of Israeli forces snipering a child in the streets outside the Nasser hospital, when you look at the footage yesterday of them sniping a mother and then sniping her child, who thankfully survived as far as I know, you have to remember that Britain has sold Israel sniper rifles. It's also sold Israel components to sniper rifles. The F-35 fighter jets, which Israel uses to bomb Gaza, and which incidentally in the Netherlands, a court has demanded the government of the Netherlands stop supplying components for. There are 100 UK-based companies that work on the F-35 fighter jet, from BAE Systems to GE Aviation to Martin Baker to Selex to Cobham to Ultra Electronics and Rolls-Royce, just to name a few. And even the F-16 fighter jet, which Israel uses more often to bomb Gaza, BAE Systems produces the HUD technology, which is the targeting acquisition aspect of that fighter jet. And BAE Systems, Britain's largest arms company, actually has an Israeli subsidiary by the name of Rokar, which equips the Israeli military directly. And then even you look at the Apache helicopters, which Israel has used in the case of October 7th, even to bomb Israelis who were fleeing from the Nova Festival. But essentially, these Apache helicopters include radar systems, navigation equipment, engine assemblies, and fire control systems, which are all made and profited from in Britain. Now, Britain ultimately is a signatory and a ratifier of the Arms Trade Treaty. And according to that treaty, Britain should not make any exports which, quote unquote, may be used for violations of international humanitarian law. And in this case, undoubtedly, these weapons are being used for violations of international humanitarian law. Britain is breaking its own laws by exporting these arms. And on December 10th, actually, when the foreign minister had the question posed to him of whether there was any legal worry about exporting to Israel, he said there would not be, even after he had received advice to the opposite. It's important to remember that the British foreign minister is David Cameron. Now, David Cameron, when he became prime minister, was forced to resign from the JNF. The JNF is the largest settlement building body in Palestine. David Cameron at that time was a patron of that organization, alongside Israel's prime minister and Israel's president, and Tony Blair, of course, who is still a patron and was a patron at the same time that he was a peace envoy to the Middle East. So what you're talking about is a heavy level of integration between Israel and Britain, which encompasses many different things. So, for instance, one strand of thought about how to manage Gaza is the imposition of the puppet Palestinian Authority. Well, who is it that trains the Palestinian Authority? Usually, it is the British. So Israel outsources the training of the Palestinian Authority to the British, particularly a company by the name of Adam Smith International, which is staffed by former British intelligence. But in the case of Gaza specifically, the Times newspaper published a report stating that the British Ministry of Defense is training Palestinian Authority forces with the stated objective of taking over the rule in Gaza the day after Hamas. So, we're dealing with a situation where Britain, the United States, and Israel operate as a trilateral security state, not only in their own countries, but across the region.
And then, I'm curious, I guess this is like kind of a multi-pronged question here, but this is all happening in the aftermath, which was a few years ago now, of the Israel lobby-led destruction of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and the real purging of pro-Palestinian voices in that party. And when you look at the streets in the UK, I mean, every single weekend, constantly, there's activism taking place for Palestine, rejecting the government's position in everything you just described. I haven't seen polling out of the UK, but I think the UK, as far as the public goes, is even more pro-Palestine than some of the polling you might see in the US. So I'm curious how all of those contradictions are playing out, especially in terms of a backlash. I know, for example, in the US, there's been a huge backlash on college campuses, lots of doxing and attacking of students. And of course, as usual, labeling everybody anti-Semitic, trying to destroy their future career prospects. Also, as a symbolic gesture for anybody considering speaking out to try to scare them and set an example. So what's going on in the UK in that regard?
Well, I think what the Corbyn era unfortunately did was educate a generation of activists to look the other way and to basically try to triangulate on the issue of Zionism. And they, rather than understanding the organizations that were acting against them as proxies of the Israeli government, which they actually are, for instance, the Board of Deputies, which was the key organization relentlessly militating against Jeremy Corbyn, it put in its own trustees report just the year after Corbynism had been vanquished at the elections, that it had, quote unquote, a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy and strengthened links with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which existed at the time, and the IDF spokesman's department. So this was the key group that militated against Corbyn, admitting in its own trustees report the extent of its relationship with Israel, and nobody, even in the left-wing media, apart from myself and Electronic Intifada and Asa Winstanley, actively covered it. People acted as if it didn't exist because it was seen as almost impolite. So there was a key misunderstanding about what all of that was. And if you actually study the trajectory of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, then you follow it to its layer. This was something that was concocted at the behest of Israel's external intelligence agency. And the IHRA not only was adopted by the Labour Party during that period, and let's be clear, the IHRA says describing Israel as a racist endeavor is in fact anti-Semitic. It also says that comparing Israel in any way, shape, or form to Nazi Germany is in and of itself a racist thing to do. Now, what happened next is that the IHRA was adopted by all institutions of government, including the Crown Prosecution Service, the police. Now, what we're seeing post-Corbynism and in the light of what's happening in Gaza is the attempt by the Israel lobby to pressure the police here to apply it in arrests, because previously the police had used a far more solid definition of anti-Semitism to guide arrests. But yet we're seeing the CPS not fully going along with the IHRA in that way. We've seen the Israel lobby target CPS figures for lobbying to try and bring them around to this point of view. And what you also have, which I would say is the antidote to that kind of willingness to subjugate ourselves and that liberal softness, is the Palestine Action movement. And Palestine Action has targeted sites belonging to Elbit Systems in this country hundreds and hundreds of times across the last few years. And that has led to almost 80 investors pulling out of Elbit Systems. It's led to Elbit Systems UK, the value of its shares decreasing by 20%. It's led to the British Ministry of Defence even cancelling £280 million worth of projects with Elbit Systems. It's also led to two Elbit Systems sites in this country being permanently shut down and vacated. And that is because Palestine Action did not enter into any discussion about identity or any discussion about what we believe, what we don't believe. Palestine Action directly targeted the material bases of Israeli operations in this country. And there's many more. You know, during that period, Raphael, an Israeli state-owned company, set up a new base in Newcastle. So Israel has very effectively been able to subjugate the political class in this country and integrate itself with the security services. But however, the pushback, and especially when you weigh it up against what you're talking about, which is the public pressure and demand for a different relationship to Palestine, it's definitely found a lot of grassroots support. You've seen, for example, the Key Logistics Company, one of only 6 companies in this country that has the right to move weapons, has recently cancelled its contracts with Elbit Systems following the targeting by Palestine Action. The website designer for Elbit Systems has cancelled its contract following targeting by Palestine Action. So essentially, you are finding an antidote to an intransigent political system which cannot answer any of these problems that people have. You are talking about generations of people that feel deeply passionate about Palestinian liberation and are desperate to do something. But essentially, they are suffering from a liberal misleadership which guides them towards a point of view which is about redeeming the political system. Well, Palestine Action is not about redeeming the political system. It's about stopping what the political system is doing in Palestine. And as I say, there's been hundreds of operations across these years led by people who in many cases have entered the courts as the accused and left as the accusers. Because remember, in the British court system, you're dealing with 12 jurors. These are members of the public that have to decide whether a person is guilty. When you are able to confront them with the reality of what Israel is doing and compare the bombing of civilian locations like hospitals, schools, churches, and mosques to the smashing of a window or a bit of paint on an arms factory, a lot of the time people are looking at that and say, well, I have nothing against these people. And in fact, I support the shutting down of these factories.
But no, that's a fantastic explanation. The next thing I wanted to ask you about, Loki, is, you know, we've all seen these insane videos of Israelis behaving very badly, but and I think both of us have watched the Israelis for our whole lives behave very badly, but this is something more intimate because of the kinds of videos they're taking, and really incredibly disturbing. We're seeing genocidal intent on display all the time. We're seeing a really egomaniacal celebration of killing babies, a celebration of bombing mosques and blowing things up and wanting to settle. I mean, it's been insane and jarring to witness just the level of depravity and arrogance and willingness to air this on the internet. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Have you been surprised by the sort of behavior that I'm talking about? And what do you think it means about Israeli society?
The society that was established in occupied Palestine was a society which had pretensions of exclusivism, but was, whether it liked it or not, to some extent, a cultural melting pot. So what I mean by that is if you look back at the first Aliyah, which was the movement of Zionists to Palestine, which took place before Theodor Herzl wrote his book, The Judenstaat, it was believed to be a failure. And the reason it was believed by the Zionist movement to be a failure is because it actually employed Palestinians to till the soil, because these people coming in did not have an understanding of how to work the Palestinian soil. And so that perceived failure led to the idea in the Zionist movement of the division of labor, which was about establishing Jewish-only industries. It led to what we understand as the muscular kibbutzism, which is sort of do-it-yourself Zionist work. Now, what you then had with Theodor Herzl was from the very beginning him talking about in his books the idea of spiriting the penniless population across the border, the idea of expulsion as a necessity for the Zionist project was there from the very, very beginning. For example, Nur al-Masalha, in the wonderful book, The Expulsion of the Palestinians, he goes through in forensic detail the way in which the earliest Zionist thinkers saw this idea of displacement, population transfer. There were attempts to lobby the Iraqi government to help them with basically transferring who they referred to, by the way, as the Jewish community in Iraq. They referred to them as human material, what they viewed as stronger human material than existed in Eastern Europe, to move them to Palestine and move the Palestinian population to Iraq. So it's always been a part of Zionist thought. It's always also been a genocidal ideology, because it has been a very idealistic and maximalist idea, which sees the cruelty on an industrial scale as being for the greater good. So these human beings that we are seeing doing these disgusting things like mocking Palestinians on TikTok, like blocking humanitarian aid, they have been inculcated with these ideas from a very, very young age. The idea that Palestinians are owners of a lesser humanity. In addition to that, all of the population have entered the Israeli military. I mean, the Israeli military is also the only place where you have people who are not even citizens of the country. They call them lone soldiers. There's about 7,000 of them in the Israeli military. You also have the grandfather clause, which says that if you have one grandparent who is Jewish, who you can prove is Jewish, then you have Israeli citizenship. So, as I say, it has pretensions of being an exclusivist society, but whether it likes it or not, especially now in the case of them bringing in tens of thousands of Indian workers, tens of thousands of Ecuadorian workers to replace the Palestinians who build the structures in the place. So you're seeing this society really convulse in fits of its own supremacy.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.